Imagine waking up one day to find out that everything you thought you knew about someone was a lie. That's exactly what happened to Ethan Montgomery, the wealthy heir who, in a moment of arrogance, married his maid, Sophia Castillo, on a reckless bet. What started as a game to prove his superiority quickly turned into a journey of self-discovery, vulnerability, and shocking revelations. No one expected what happened next, not even him. You see, Sophia Castillo wasn't just a quiet, unassuming woman. Her past held a secret so shocking, it would turn his world upside down. As their eyes locked during the wedding ceremony, Ethan couldn't shake the knot in his stomach, a silent warning that this marriage was about to teach him a lesson he'd never forget. But here's the twist, this isn't just a story about love or betrayal. It's a story about how societal expectations, superficial judgments, and the pressure to conform can blind us to the truth, and how sometimes, the most unexpected people, like Sophia, can change our lives in ways we never imagined. So, what happens next? You won't believe how this story unfolds. From heart-racing moments to unexpected twists, this tale will challenge everything you think you know about wealth, status, and the power of genuine connection. Ready to dive in? Let's uncover the shocking secret that changed Ethan and Sophia's lives forever. It all started with a bet, a reckless, arrogant wager that no one expected to spiral into something so life-altering. Ethan Montgomery, the wealthy heir known for his charm and superficiality, was at a party, surrounded by yes-men and sycophants. The air was thick with laughter and the clinking of glasses, but his heart raced with boredom. That's when the idea struck him, like a bolt of lightning. What happens next will shock everyone, he thought, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. He'd marry his maid, Sophia Castillo, a woman from a world so far removed from his own, just to prove a point. It was a game, nothing more. Or so he believed. Sophia, a quiet woman with eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 untold stories, was the target of his whimsical bet. She was vulnerable, yes, but there was a strength in her that no one had bothered to notice. When Ethan proposed the idea to his friends, they laughed, thinking it was another one of his absurd jokes. But he wasn't joking. He forced himself to stay calm as he laid out the terms, his arrogance blinding him to the gravity of his decision. Little did he know, this bet would become the most profound lesson of his life. As the days passed, Ethan found himself staring at Sophia more often, his curiosity piqued by her quiet resilience. There was something about the way she carried herself, the way her eyes locked with his, unflinching, that made him uneasy. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was an unexpected depth to her that he hadn't anticipated. The knot in his stomach grew tighter with each passing day, a silent warning that this bet might not be as simple as he'd thought. The wedding day arrived, and Ethan walked down the aisle with a smirk, convinced he was in control. But as he stood there, staring into Sophia's eyes, he felt a shift, a subtle, almost imperceptible change in the air. She wasn't the fragile, vulnerable woman he'd assumed her to be. There was a fire in her gaze, a quiet defiance that made his heart race in a way he couldn't explain. No one expected this, least of all him. The bet had seemed like a harmless game, but now, he wasn't so sure. In the days that followed, Ethan found himself grappling with emotions he hadn't anticipated. Sophia, no, his wife, wasn't what he'd expected. She was kind, yes, but also fiercely independent, with a wisdom that seemed to cut through his superficiality. He'd entered this marriage thinking he'd be the one to teach her a lesson, but now, he wasn't so sure who was teaching whom. The knot in his stomach tightened, a constant reminder that he was in uncharted territory. As they settled into their new life, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the brink of something monumental. The bet had been a reckless act of arrogance, but now, it felt like something more. He couldn't help but wonder, what happens next? Sophia had a past that no one knew about, a secret that would soon come to light. And when it did, it would change everything. But for now, he was left staring into the unknown, his heart racing with a mix of fear and anticipation. Ethan had always been a man of control, but now, he felt anything but. The bet had seemed like a simple game, a way to assert his dominance and prove a point. But as he stood there, staring at Sophia, he realized that he was no longer in control. The game had changed, and so had he. The question was, would he rise to the challenge, or would he crumble under the weight of his own arrogance? Only time would tell. At first, Ethan saw the marriage as nothing more than a spectacle, a grand performance to entertain his ego. He walked through their shared home with a smirk, his eyes locking on Sophia's every move, as if daring her to challenge him. To him, she was just a pawn in his game, a target for his amusement. He'd forced himself to stay calm during the wedding, but now, in the privacy of their home, he let his arrogance shine. "This'll be fun," he thought, his heart racing with a mix of excitement and superiority. Sophia seemed to play along, but there was something in her gaze that made him uneasy. She wasn't the vulnerable, submissive woman he'd expected. Instead, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that no one had prepared him for. Ethan found himself staring at her more often than he'd like to admit, trying to decipher the mystery behind her calm demeanor. What happens next? He didn't know, but the knot in his stomach was a constant reminder that this wasn't going as planned. Ethan's friends, of course, were thrilled by the drama. They'd placed their bets, laughing at the absurdity of it all. "No one expected you to actually go through with it," one of them joked, clapping him on the back. But Ethan just smiled, confident that he was in control. He'd prove them all wrong, he thought. This marriage was his game, and he was the one calling the shots. Or so he believed. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan began to notice little things he hadn't expected. Like the way Sophia would hum softly while cleaning, or the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her favorite books. He'd never bothered to ask about her interests before, but now, he found himself curious. What was her story? What secrets was she hiding? The more he watched her, the more he realized that she wasn't the simple, vulnerable woman he'd assumed her to be. Ethan's initial perception of the marriage began to crack under the weight of these small, unexpected revelations. He'd thought this would be a lesson for Sophia, a way to show her the right way to live. But now, he wasn't so sure. The knot in his stomach grew tighter with each passing day, a silent warning that he was losing control of the game. What happens next? He didn't know, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to learn a lesson of his own. By the end of the first month, Ethan was forced to confront a truth he hadn't anticipated: this marriage wasn't just a game. It was real, and so were the emotions it was stirring within him. He'd started this journey with arrogance and superficiality, but now, he was staring into the unknown, his heart racing with a mix of fear and curiosity. Sophia was no longer just a target, she was a person, with a past and a story that he was desperate to uncover. Ethan had always been a man of control, but now, he felt anything but. The game had changed, and so had he. The question was, would he rise to the challenge, or would he crumble under the weight of his own arrogance? Only time would tell. Ethan had always been a man of certainty, but now, he found himself questioning everything. The marriage, which had started as a bet, was slowly chipping away at his carefully constructed facade. He'd forced himself to stay calm in the beginning, convinced that he could maintain control. But as the days turned into weeks, he realized that control was an illusion. His heart racing, he began to see the world, and himself, in a new light. It started with the small things. Like the way Sophia would smile when he brought her a cup of tea, or the way her eyes locked with his when she spoke about her dreams. No one had ever looked at him like that before, not with such genuine warmth. It made him feel vulnerable, a sensation he wasn't used to. The knot in his stomach tightened every time he thought about it, a silent reminder that he was changing in ways he hadn't expected. Ethan's friends noticed the shift, too. "What's gotten into you?" one of them asked, staring at him with a mix of curiosity and concern. Ethan just shrugged, forcing himself to stay calm. But deep down, he knew the truth: he wasn't the same person he'd been when he made that bet. The marriage had become more than a game, it was a lesson, one that was challenging everything he thought he knew about life, love, and himself. As the weeks turned into months, Ethan found himself drawn to Sophia in ways he couldn't explain. He'd started reading the books she loved, just to have something to talk about. He'd even begun to notice the little things, the way she'd hum while cooking, or the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her childhood. It was unexpected, this connection they were building, and it left him feeling both exhilarated and terrified. Ethan's transformation wasn't just about his feelings for Sophia, though. It was about the way he saw the world. He'd always judged people based on their wealth and status, but now, he was beginning to see the flaws in that mindset. Sophia had shown him that there was more to life than material possessions. She'd taught him that true worth couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. It was a lesson he hadn't expected to learn, but one he desperately needed. By the end of the year, Ethan was a different man. The arrogance and superficiality that had once defined him were gone, replaced by a newfound humility and understanding. He'd started the marriage thinking he'd be the one to teach Sophia a lesson, but now, he realized that she'd been the one teaching him all along. The knot in his stomach was still there, a constant reminder of how far he'd come, but it no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it felt like a promise to keep growing, to keep learning, and to keep challenging the beliefs that had once held him back. Ethan had always been a man of control, but now, he understood that true strength came from vulnerability. The marriage had started as a bet, but it had become so much more. It had become a journey of self-discovery, growth, and transformation. And as he stood there, staring into Sophia's eyes, he couldn't help but wonder, what happens next? Ethan had always been quick to judge, his opinions shaped by the superficial standards of his world. Wealth, status, appearance, these were the metrics he used to measure a person's worth. But the marriage had forced him to confront the flaws in that mindset. No one expected it, least of all him, but Sophia had shattered his preconceived notions with a quiet strength that left him reeling. At first, he dismissed her as just another vulnerable target, someone he could mold to fit his narrative. But as he spent more time with her, he began to see the cracks in his own logic. Her eyes, which he'd once thought were empty, now seemed to hold a depth of wisdom and resilience that he couldn't ignore. The knot in his stomach tightened every time he thought about how wrong he'd been, a silent reminder of the dangers of superficial judgments. Ethan's friends, of course, were still trapped in that world of shallow perceptions. They'd laugh and joke about his experiment, completely oblivious to the transformation he was undergoing. "What happens next?" they'd ask, staring at him with a mix of curiosity and amusement. But Ethan just forced himself to stay calm, knowing that they wouldn't understand. They couldn't see what he was beginning to see, that true worth had nothing to do with wealth or status. It wasn't just about Sophia, though. Ethan began to notice how often he'd made similar judgments about others, how he dismissed people based on their jobs, their backgrounds, or their appearances. He'd always thought he was better than them, but now, he wasn't so sure. The marriage had become a mirror, reflecting back all the flaws in his thinking. It was a lesson he hadn't expected to learn, but one he desperately needed. The more he reflected, the more he realized how much he'd missed by judging people so quickly. He'd missed out on genuine connections, on meaningful conversations, on the chance to learn from others. Sophia had shown him that there was so much more to a person than what met the eye. Her past, her struggles, her dreams, they all added layers to her story that he'd been too blind to see before. Ethan's heart raced as he thought about all the opportunities he'd wasted, all the people he'd overlooked because they didn't fit his narrow definition of success. It was a sobering realization, one that left him feeling both humbled and inspired. He'd started the marriage thinking he'd be the one to teach Sophia a lesson, but now, he understood that she'd been the one teaching him all along. As he stood there, staring into her eyes, he couldn't help but wonder, how many others had he misjudged? How many stories had he missed because he'd been too focused on the surface? The knot in his stomach was a constant reminder of the dangers of superficial judgments, but it was also a call to action, a call to see people for who they truly were, not just for what they appeared to be. From the moment he could remember, Ethan had been taught that wealth and status were the ultimate measures of success. Society had drilled it into him, shaping his decisions, his relationships, and even his self-worth. But the marriage had thrown all of that into question. No one expected it, least of all him, but Sophia had become a living, breathing challenge to everything he'd been raised to believe. At first, he dismissed her as just another vulnerable target, someone who didn't fit into his world of privilege and power. But as he spent more time with her, he began to see the cracks in the societal standards he'd always taken for granted. Her eyes, which he'd once thought were empty, now seemed to hold a quiet defiance, a refusal to be defined by the circumstances of her birth. The knot in his stomach tightened every time he thought about it, a silent reminder of how deeply those standards had shaped him. Ethan's friends, of course, were still trapped in that world of superficial values. They'd laugh and joke about his experiment, completely oblivious to the transformation he was undergoing. What happens next? They'd ask, staring at him with a mix of curiosity and amusement. But Ethan just forced himself to stay calm, knowing that they wouldn't understand. They couldn't see what he was beginning to see, that true worth had nothing to do with wealth or status. It wasn't just about Sophia, though. Ethan began to notice how often he'd made decisions based on societal expectations, how he'd chosen friends, partners, and even hobbies based on what would make him look good in the eyes of others. He'd always thought he was in control, but now, he realized that society had been pulling the strings all along. The marriage had become a mirror, reflecting back all the ways he'd been shaped by external pressures. The more he reflected, the more he realized how much he'd sacrificed to meet those standards. He'd sacrificed his authenticity, his happiness, even his sense of self. Sophia had shown him that there was another way, a way to live that wasn't defined by societal expectations. Her past, her struggles, her dreams, they all added layers to her story that he'd been too blind to see before. Ethan's heart raced as he thought about all the ways he'd been shaped by societal standards, all the choices he'd made to fit into a mold that wasn't his own. It was a sobering realization, one that left him feeling both humbled and inspired. He'd started the marriage thinking he'd be the one to teach Sophia a lesson, but now, he understood that she'd been the one teaching him all along. As he stood there, staring into her eyes, he couldn't help but wonder, how much of his life had been dictated by societal standards? How much of his worth had he tied to external measures of success? The knot in his stomach was a constant reminder of the influence of those standards, but it was also a call to action, a call to redefine success on his own terms. The bet had started as a joke, a way for Ethan to prove his superiority and entertain his friends. But as the days turned into weeks, it became something far more profound, a challenge that forced him to confront his own values and beliefs. No one expected it, least of all him, but Sophia had become the catalyst for his personal growth. Her quiet strength and unwavering resilience were a lesson he hadn't seen coming. At first, Ethan had tried to maintain control, forcing himself to stay calm as he navigated the unfamiliar waters of their marriage. But the more time he spent with Sophia, the more he realized that control was an illusion. Her eyes, which he'd once thought were empty, now seemed to hold a depth of wisdom and understanding that left him feeling vulnerable. The knot in his stomach tightened every time he thought about how much he still had to learn. Ethan's friends, of course, were still stuck in their world of superficial values. They'd laugh and joke about his experiment, oblivious to his transformation. "What happens next?" they'd ask, staring at him with amusement. But Ethan just smiled, knowing they couldn't grasp what he was beginning to see. True growth came from challenges, not comfort. It wasn't just about Sophia, though. Ethan began to notice how his privilege had shielded him from real struggles. He'd always thought he was in control, but now, he realized he'd lived in a bubble. The marriage became a mirror, reflecting his complacency. Sophia's past, her resilience, her quiet defiance, they forced him to confront his own blind spots. By the end of the year, Ethan had learned to value qualities like kindness and authenticity. Sophia had shown him that material wealth couldn't measure a person's worth. His heart raced as he reflected on how far he'd come. He'd started this marriage to teach her a lesson, but she'd been the one unraveling his arrogance all along. Ethan had always believed social class defined a person, until Sophia shattered that illusion. What began as a bet became a reckoning. Her quiet defiance, the way her eyes locked with his during arguments, made him question everything. No one expected a maid to dismantle his worldview, least of all him. At parties, Ethan's friends still mocked the marriage, calling it a charity project. But they couldn't see Sophia's sharp wit, the way she debated literature with him at midnight, or how her laughter filled their home. Ethan began to notice how often he dismissed people like her, those without titles or trust funds, and felt a gnawing shame. Sophia, meanwhile, refused to play the role of the meek wife. When Ethan tried to flaunt his wealth, she'd counter with stories of her childhood in a cramped apartment, finding joy in borrowed books and shared meals. Her pride in her roots forced him to see the emptiness of his own glittering world. The more Ethan listened, the more he realized how societal stereotypes had poisoned his perspective. Sophia wasn't the help, she was a woman who'd fought for every opportunity, her resilience a mirror to his own entitlement. The bet had been a joke, but their marriage became a rebellion, against labels, against expectations, against the lie that money defined worth. By the time Sophia's secret emerged, a scholarship she'd hidden out of pride, Ethan no longer cared about status. He saw her as she was, brilliant, unyielding, and utterly human. The stereotypes he'd clung to crumbled, leaving room for something real. Ethan had once believed love could be bought, until Sophia laughed at his first attempt to impress her with jewelry. "Do you think this matters?" she'd said, her voice soft but unflinching. That moment, the crack in his arrogance began to widen. Their late-night conversations became his addiction. Sophia spoke of her mother's sacrifices, her dreams of becoming a teacher, the joy of tending to a community garden. Ethan, who'd never known hunger or want, found himself envious of her stories. Her life, though marked by struggle, pulsed with a richness his wealth couldn't replicate. When Ethan lost a business deal, he expected mockery. Instead, Sophia handed him a tattered copy of Pride and Prejudice. "Read this," she said. "It's about someone like you." As he flipped through the pages, he saw himself in Darcy's arrogance, and her in Elizabeth's quiet strength. The realization humbled him. Material possessions lost their luster. Ethan sold his third sports car to fund Sophia's teaching degree, a decision that shocked his friends. But Sophia's tears that day, genuine, unguarded, felt more valuable than any car. For the first time, he understood, connection wasn't transactional. It was the way her hand brushed his when she passed him coffee, or how she remembered his childhood fear of storms. By their first anniversary, Ethan's penthouse felt hollow compared to their cramped kitchen, alive with Sophia's humming and the scent of her abuela's recipes. Wealth hadn't brought him happiness, she had. Ethan's transformation was obvious: softer smiles, quieter confidence. But Sophia's evolution was just as profound. The woman who once lowered her gaze now met his head-on, her voice steady when she disagreed. "You're not always right," she'd say, and Ethan would laugh, disarmed by her boldness. When Sophia enrolled in night classes, Ethan insisted on driving her. In the car, she'd quiz him on pedagogy theories, and he'd feign exasperation while secretly marveling at her passion. One evening, she dragged him to a community center where she volunteered. Watching her teach children to read, Ethan felt a pang of awe and regret. How many people like her had he overlooked? Sophia, too, began to shed her distrust. She shared stories of her father's abandonment, her mother's illness, stories she buried for years. Ethan, in turn, confessed his loneliness growing up in a mansion full of strangers. Their vulnerabilities became a bridge, each confession erasing the divide between Heir and Maid. Even their fights transformed. Once, Ethan would storm out; now, he stayed, listening as Sophia dissected his ego with surgical precision. And when he apologized, genuinely, without deflection, she'd smile, a silent acknowledgement of his growth. By the time Sophia graduated, their dynamic had flipped. Ethan, once the teacher, now sought her advice on everything from investments to friendships. "You've ruined me," he joked one night. Sophia raised an eyebrow. "Or saved you," she replied. Neither could deny the truth in it. Ethan's world was a gilded cage. Society demanded he marry a socialite, host charity galas, and uphold the Montgomery legacy. Marrying Sophia was an act of rebellion, one that cost him invitations, sneers at parties, and a frosty call from his father. "You're embarrassing us," the old man hissed. But for the first time, Ethan didn't care. Sophia faced different pressures. Her family warned her not to trust rich boys playing games. Friends accused her of selling out. Yet she stayed, not for money, but because she saw the man beneath the Heir, a man as trapped by expectations as she'd been by poverty. At a charity event, a society matron snubbed Sophia, calling her a gold digger. Ethan nearly exploded, but Sophia squeezed his hand. "Let them talk," she whispered. Later, she confessed it stung, but added, "I'd rather be hated for who I am than loved for a lie." The words haunted Ethan. How many lies had he lived? The final blow came when Ethan's father threatened to disinherit him. Years ago, he'd have crumbled. Now, he simply handed back the family ring. "Keep it," he said. "I don't need your money to know who I am." Sophia's quiet pride that night felt like a victory. In the end, they carved a space outside society's demands. Ethan traded tailored suits for teaching assistant gigs at Sophia's school. She wore thrift store dresses to his board meetings, unapologetic. The world still whispered, but their laughter drowned it out. Ethan had always measured success in terms of wealth, status, and power. But Sophia's presence in his life forced him to rethink everything. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of their modest apartment, Sophia asked him, "What makes you happy, Ethan?" The question caught him off guard. He'd never truly considered it. At first, he listed the usual markers: his penthouse, his car collection, his name on the board of directors. But Sophia's silence made him pause. "Those things," she said gently, "are just things. They don't make you happy. They just make you comfortable." Her words lingered in his mind, a quiet challenge to his entire worldview. Over time, Ethan began to notice the small joys Sophia brought into his life: the way she danced while cooking, the way she laughed at his terrible jokes, the way she held his hand during thunderstorms. These moments, fleeting and unremarkable to an outsider, became the foundation of his happiness. He realized that success wasn't about accumulating wealth, it was about finding meaning in the everyday. When Ethan's father cut him off financially, he expected to feel lost. Instead, he felt liberated. For the first time, he wasn't living for someone else's approval. He took a job at a non-profit, using his business acumen to help underprivileged communities. Sophia's pride in his work became his greatest reward. By their second anniversary, Ethan had sold most of his luxury possessions. The money went into funding Sophia's dream of opening a community school. Watching her light up as she planned the curriculum, Ethan realized he'd never been prouder of anything in his life. Success, he now understood, wasn't about what you had, it was about what you gave. Ethan's transformation was undeniable. The man who once flaunted his wealth now wore thrift store sweaters and volunteered at soup kitchens. But Sophia's growth was equally profound. The quiet, reserved Maid had blossomed into a confident, outspoken advocate for education reform. When Sophia first proposed her idea for a community school, Ethan expected her to falter under the pressure. Instead, she thrived. She negotiated with donors, rallied volunteers, and even stood up to skeptical board members. "You've changed," Ethan told her one night, his voice filled with admiration. Sophia smiled. "So have you." Their relationship became a partnership in every sense. Ethan handled the logistics, while Sophia focused on the vision. They argued, of course, about budgets, timelines, and even the color of the school's walls, but their fights were productive, born of mutual respect rather than ego. One evening, as they reviewed the school's progress, Sophia turned to Ethan and said, "I never thought I'd be here. With you. Doing this." Ethan took her hand. "Neither did I," he admitted. "But I'm glad we are." Their growth wasn't just individual, it was collective. Together, they built something that mattered, not just to themselves, but to their community. And in doing so, they became the best versions of themselves. Ethan's journey from arrogance to humility wasn't linear. There were moments of backsliding, times when he'd catch himself judging someone based on their appearance or status. But each time, Sophia's voice would echo in his mind, "Do better." One such moment came at a gala, where Ethan overheard a group of businessmen mocking a waiter. The old Ethan would have laughed along. The new Ethan intervened. "You don't know his story," he said, his voice firm. The men stared at him, stunned. Later, Sophia squeezed his hand. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. Ethan's humility wasn't just about treating others with respect, it was about recognizing his own flaws. He began to apologize, not just to Sophia, but to the people he'd hurt in the past. One of the most difficult apologies was to a former employee he'd fired unfairly. The man's forgiveness felt like a weight lifted from Ethan's shoulders. By the time the community school opened, Ethan had shed the last remnants of his old self. He no longer needed to prove his worth through wealth or status. His worth, he now understood, came from the lives he touched and the love he shared with Sophia. The story of Ethan and Sophia is a critique of a society that values wealth over character. From the beginning, Ethan's world is one of superficiality, where people are judged by their bank accounts, not their hearts. Sophia's presence disrupts this world, forcing Ethan, and the audience, to question what truly matters. One of the most poignant moments comes when Sophia confronts Ethan's father. "You think your money makes you better than me," she says, her voice steady. "But it doesn't. It just makes you lonely." The old man is speechless, his arrogance momentarily shaken. The narrative also highlights the systemic barriers faced by people like Sophia. Her intelligence, resilience, and kindness are overlooked because of her social class. It's only through her relationship with Ethan that she's given the opportunity to shine, a commentary on how society often dismisses potential based on arbitrary measures. By the end, the story advocates for a more inclusive perspective, one that values people for who they are, not what they have. It's a call to action, urging viewers to look beyond appearances and recognize the humanity in everyone. Ethan and Sophia's story is a testament to the power of love and growth. What began as a reckless bet became a journey of self-discovery, challenging both characters to confront their biases and redefine their values. The lessons are clear: superficial judgments blind us to the beauty of others, and true happiness comes from authentic connections. Ethan's transformation from a wealthy heir to a humble advocate for change is a reminder that it's never too late to grow. Sophia's journey from a dismissed maid to a confident leader shows that worth isn't determined by circumstances. As the story ends, Ethan and Sophia stand together at the opening of the community school, surrounded by children and families. The camera pans to their intertwined hands, a symbol of their journey and the love that made it possible. The final message is one of hope, that no matter where we start, we can choose to grow, to love, and to make a difference. And in doing so, we can create a world where everyone is valued for who they are, not what they have. So, what did you think of this emotional journey? Ethan Montgomery started with arrogance and superficiality, but ended up learning life-changing lessons. And you? Did you expect a different ending, or were you as surprised as he was? This story isn't just about love or shocking secrets, it's a powerful reminder of how superficial judgments can blind us and how genuine connections, like the one between Ethan and Sophia, have the power to transform lives. So, let's reflect. What impacted you the most? Was it Ethan's evolution, Sophia Castillo's strength, or the way they challenged stereotypes and societal expectations? If this story made you think, don't forget to like the video and share in the comments what stood out to you the most. Your opinion matters to us. And if you want to keep diving into narratives that mix drama, life lessons, and unexpected twists, make sure to follow the channel and turn on notifications. There's so much more amazing content coming your way, and you won't want to miss it. So, what will you take away from this story? Let's continue this journey of reflection and growth together. Hit the like button, share your thoughts, and let's keep the conversation going.